Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to the third episode of Stepping from Stone to Stone, a podcast discussing combat silat and the underlying principles, attributes, and strategies behind all combat. I'm your host, Aaron Chappell, self-described regular guy, and with me is Guru Sean Stark, who has hopefully had enough coffee to make it through this, and also happens to be the founder of PSP. Hey Guru, how you doing this morning?
Good. I also use coffee when I teach too.
Isn't that a traditional teaching method, the coffee and the cigarette? I know you don't smoke, but...
Yeah, coffee and a big cigarette. I think I'd probably roll better with some bourbon and a cigar, but...
Well, next time you come down, I'll see if I can make that a reality. We'll have to find a place to train outside. I don't think our host down here would appreciate his school smelling like good
well,
cigars.
It smells like dirty socks, so I mean, you might as well add a little cigar.
You know, that's just character. Every good school should smell a little bit like BO and, dirty socks and everything.
Just means they're working.
Yeah. Well, I've never walked into a good school that smelled clean, sadly.
Truth.
So, hey, last time we were talking, we talked a little bit about discussing body culture and kind of how it affects what we do and how it makes it different from some of the other silat styles and combative styles that are out there. And when you and I were discussing this, we kind of wanted to figure out a way to approach this respectfully. We don't want to offend anybody who's back in Indonesia or who may be listening and going, those guys don't know what they're talking about. So with that said, we are two white Western males discussing things that we've observed, but I don't think we're saying that our knowledge is all-encompassing on this. These are just observations made humbly. Is that kind of more or less what we had talked about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like I said, I'm willing to talk about some of the things I've noticed, and I mean, our post podcast conversation was pretty good too, so hopefully you'll add in as well and keep us flowing. But yeah, just really want to not so much make a big deal out of even the differences as much as just point some that are out there and then talk about what I've tried to do given my own perspective. Okay,
so I guess where we could start is, what is body culture? We've heard the term personal culture, social culture, but body culture may be a new one to some of the people listening.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I look at body culture as the way that we generally operate every day. So in Western culture, specifically more so today than 30 years ago, we have a lot more sitting. We drive a lot more. We sit in our cars. We sit at work. And so our body culture is kind of sedentary, in my opinion, unless we make an exaggerated effort to try to do something about that. I know that excludes a huge portion of our population who bust their ass every day, but our body culture, varies accordingly. That's again why I was hesitant to say that I know everything about any body culture, including our own. But generally we're larger framed. We have a lot more. I would say we have a lot of people who are more overweight and things like that. And I think that is kind of a direct reflection of, again, that culture that we've created that's more sedentary, but also it has to do with our food prep and all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's so much to body culture depending on where we want to go with it. I think, one of the conversations we had was, how does that translate to combat? And, I know from my own experience fighting that, generally speaking, we tend to be headhunters in the West, meaning that's our primary attacking point, our target. So those are things that I think are body culture. But essentially how we move every day and how aware we are of our own bodies.
Yeah, and looking at it from my perspective, I think I kind of describe body culture as part non-lingual psychology. You know, it's the talking that you do with your body. So that was part of one of our post-podcast conversations. You know, some cultures talk with their hands. Some cultures have a very still body language.
Right.
I can't remember if I mentioned it to you, but there's a video I love because it illustrates a difference in body culture. There's a huge white deputy who is yelling at two gentlemen who are part of like the Mexican cowboy culture. And he's getting very animated and gesturing and loud. And at one point, one of the cowboys just turns around and takes off a very expensive Stetson. He hasn't made any movements and is just getting more and more still as things are going off. And he takes this Stetson off and he puts it on the hood of the car. And when he turns around, the fight starts.
Right.
And, you know, the guy who, that deputy, if you asked him, you know, why do you think that happened or whatever, he probably couldn't tell you. But as this guy's just getting more still and more quiet, and the other guy's getting more animated because he's not getting anything to go off of. Yeah. I'm looking at it, it's like, yeah, I'm hearing the Jaws music, da 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 da.
Yep. I think too, it even encompasses things like personal space.
Yeah.
You know, we in the West, you know, I'd say an average personal space for a friend is, you know, might be 3 feet away or something. You're talking maybe 2 feet if you're kind of having a more intimate conversation. But I would say 3 feet's not abnormal. You know, of course, that's a generalization. And then there are those people, you know, that make you completely uncomfortable and they have to be up in your space. You're like, dude, this is like so close. I don't know if I'm supposed to be kissing you or what.
Kissing or punching, it's going to happen soon.
Yeah, those guys are an anomaly, you know. But, you know, I've noticed, like, when I've trained with Indonesian teachers that largely, there are a few, but largely, you know, they won't put their arm around you necessarily or anything like that. They'll just stand there. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the West, everybody puts their arm around each other, you know, and screws around or whatever. Yeah. So it's just little things like that you notice, and it's their form of respect, and ours is, you know, different. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's the close talkers. I always found interesting. One of my friends, he went over to Afghanistan. He was deployed with our military, and he talked about they were interfacing with a lot of village and tribal elders up there in the mountains, and he talked about how it was really common to hold another man's hand up there.
That's enough.
And that was like a sign of friendship up there. And, you know, obviously it's not like left hand to left hand or whatever, because that gets into a whole different deal. Yeah. But, you know, in our Western culture, you really don't see two men holding hands if they're both adults. Outside of specific subcultures where they might have some kind of romantic attachment. But in general, it's just not done.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's one I've run into. I'm trying to remember where I was. I think I was actually in Indonesia. And yeah, I was in Papua, but that's still Indonesia. Mm-hmm. And one of the guys, I have a photo of him awkwardly having his hand held by a guy there in it's kind of a farmer's market, a marketplace, open market. Mm-hmm. Just pausing to have a photo, and he was just so nervous looking. It's hilarious. Yeah, you know, and the thing that one of the things that we've talked about is in Indonesian culture, there's a you know, generally there's no, I don't know of any left-handers, you know, so that's a kind of a uniquely, I think probably a Muslim culture issue, and you know, so everything is handed to you via right hand, and you're received via right hand, and I found that kind of interesting, so I specifically don't do that in our training because unfortunately I've had a few of those lefties come through my class and I have to accommodate them. So that's an area of culture where I've specifically addressed it and said, I don't care what strike you throw, what hand you throw it with, I don't care what side you choose as strong side, I have a strong side culture system. So what that basically means is if you're a left-hander, then you can essentially do everything leading with your strong side, or maybe not leading with it, but using your strong side as your favorite tool, and that includes weapons and whatever else. So that's an area where our body culture is different, probably. And then we have a body culture that, like I said, is pretty sedentary, and so I start people doing the Monyet and harm out or the ground stuff as our exercise, and I do that primarily to get people moving from positions and getting them flexible and building strength and stuff. Even though that's our sort of second tier of instructorship, is learning how to fight from the ground to get back up. It's such a issue, I think, for Western people generally to move like that I start them right away from the start, trying to get them fluid, mobile, strong, flexible, and more gradually building up their strength and stuff like that. So if you hear any rattling, my pit bull just walked in and decided he was going to push on the computer. He likes to do that. He's jealous of anything.
Yeah, that's kind of where it's important, I think, to be aware of your body culture and kind of the implicit things, the things that are not explicitly stated about it. Because, if you talk to somebody from Indonesia, or if you talk to somebody from over here and you ask them, why do you move this way? That's what we do.
Right.
I've studied some of the Japanese styles over time. I won't go into to which one specifically, just in case anybody's listening or is waiting to say, he's wrong about that.
Well, that's probably going to happen anyway.
Oh, well, if we don't offend at least 3 or 4 people per podcast, I don't know if we're doing our jobs.
Yeah, right.
But yeah, it was interesting to look at some of the physical culture aspects that are open over there, like why don't you wear your swords for a left-handed draw, or why don't you enter with your left hand? If everybody is entering with their right hand, it would seem to geek people up if you're suddenly switch that on them, like a southpaw in boxing. They're like, oh, we just don't do that. Well, why? Well, that's just not what we do.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and there are exceptions, of course. There, but yeah, overall, that's true. I mean, and so I've specifically tried to address that, even going so far that, when we do our bowing patterns, I specifically do a right and a left portion of that, just to emphasize the balance of it for us. Of course, I lead right hand because we're the more superior. but it, trying to kind of illustrate the balance between it, illustrate the fundamental need to know both left and right. And so, yeah, those are things that are just not really addressed so much that I've seen anyway. And it's perfectly legitimate for them. But in the U.S., part of the reason of the change for me was, I had Indonesian teachers who were very clear that this should be adaptable. You should adapt your silat to what your goals are. Rudy Waranatakasuma from Sunda Silat, he was very instrumental in that, because he would say, you just make it work however your wanting to apply it. So, I'd see him do his jurus, and his brother Robbie, both fantastic Silat guys, and their jurus looked different, the same but different. And then I watched a third guy do it, and his were much different. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That kind of led me down this path that obviously we need to be adaptable. But then I looked at it like, well, how then am I adapting to the Western body? And of course, you don't want to over adapt and go back to sedentary, right? Like, the purpose is to become better overall human beings. This includes physically, mentally, spiritually, whatever. And so to just strictly adapt to what a lazy Westerner might do just so that they're comfortable is obviously not where we want to be either. So we're, it's just trying to find that balance between the two and know what our culture does, and then figure out the best ways to build it up and respond to that. There's obviously the potential for differences in size, and age requirements, and all those things also affect body culture. So I don't want to say age requirements, age. When I was in Pomor, there was multiple versions of jurus. So you'd have jurus haramau, and it would be like, well, you can do, two-handed cartwheel, a single-handed cartwheel, or a no-handed cartwheel. Well, I'm 6'1", and I could probably do a no-handed cartwheel. At the time, I was probably closer to 235 to I don't know, heavier. And I was able to do the single-handed cartwheel and the two-handed, obviously, but the no-handed was like, I'm not sure that I have the momentum to make that. And I'm not really sure that I need to make that. Like, at what point is this just exercise, right? And so if I can put a single hand down and do it, then that's pretty good. And, but then they also had like, well, this is a higher version of a haramau jurus, and this is a lower version of a haramau jurus, and that was based off of age, primarily. Their purpose was to like, hey, if you can't do it this way, then you should be able to do it this way. So for me, that kind of led me, into this realization that, I don't have to exactly mimic everything that's being done in order to be successful. What I have to do is understand how best to get everybody that comes along who wants to learn, to give them the best opportunity to grow and be challenged and all that stuff. So,
well, I think that adjusting our art for not just a personal adaptation but a cultural one, that's a missing piece that I've seen in a lot of the traditional martial arts that I've studied. You touched on the differences in size, and actually the differences in body composition. We have a different diet than a lot of other cultures around the world from a very early age.
And we don't have, we don't squat. Our culture generally does not squat.
Oh my God, that's a huge one.
I mean, I have never seen anybody really do it other than when they've been asked to do it, or they're doing it specifically for an exercise like the squat. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, you don't see it done. But in Indonesia, it's a matter of everyday course. Like, it's just what happens. And so their legs and knees and tendons and ligaments are built up from day one to do that. I have literally photos from when I was in Papua of these little children, maybe, I don't know, my guess is they were 5 or 6, somewhere in there, playing marbles in this alley, and they were all squatting just as a matter of play. And they never really got up. They were there for, 15 minutes while I was shooting. And if I squatted for 15 minutes, I would have to take a break.
Go sit somewhere.
Yeah, and then likewise, I've seen elderly Indonesian males mostly, but squatting, smoking a cigarette, just casually hanging out and doing their thing by the side of the road, So it's just a thing we don't do at all. So those things dramatically change I think anyway, they dramatically change your ability to even endure squatting and kneeling and all that stuff with your knees, because you're building it up from the beginning. So,
well, I think also on that, you touched on it a little bit earlier, talking about 6'1" and at that time 235, not being able to do a no-handed cartwheel. We in the West and specifically in America, we have different opportunities open to us because of the different body culture. I have a guy in my training group who is 6'4" and about 320 pounds. He's a former lineman for a local college, and he runs cattle during the week. That is a big bubba. Yeah. And why would you want him to fight like he's 5'3" and 110 pounds when he has a whole opportunity in being freaking huge? That that guy at 5'3" and 110 pounds,
could never,
he'll never be able to fight like my friend Nate. But and there's no point. You're missing out on what Nate could be if you try to make him do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
and it takes somebody who's, to me, it's somebody who is at least 6 feet or more, or used to working with people of that size, to kind of appreciate the opportunities afforded by it.
Yeah.
When you've got a 9-foot reach, cool stuff starts to open up.
Yeah, when you can literally hit somebody from across the room. Hugo, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that we underestimate that component quite a bit in martial arts. I mean, the Japanese have a very specific, their body culture is geared towards this very specific process, right? It doesn't mean they aren't organic at all, but they have this very, it's more regimented, more structured, and that's a component of mentality, right? As much as it's a component of their physical side. So, it all connects together. So, I mean, I've taught Indonesians, and not many, but the few that I've taught, that I've shared PSP with, so much difference in learning style. They would literally not really ask questions, actually never asked questions exactly, and they just would watch you, and then they would do it. And it wasn't, almost never were you like, oh, you need to change this or change that. You could, there were things you detailed, but they were very good at watching what you did and learning that way, as opposed to Americans who, you have to tell them 20 different ways, then you got to prove it, and then you got to show them because they still can't actually do it, and then they're going to probably say this won't work for them before they even figure out how to do it. There's all of this other stuff that happens, and it's just a completely different mentality, but it impacts I'd say that it impacts their body culture, but their mental culture as well.
Well, we were talking about that this morning, talking about some of the offensive hand entries. I've told people what I'm going to do. I've demonstrated it.
Yeah.
And at slow speed, and then when you move into free movement, you're still catching people with the thing that you've told them and demonstrated that you're doing. They're like, I just don't feel like I can stop that. Well, not moving like you are right now. That's awesome. That's part of the fun for me.
Yeah. One, it's funny too, because in very interesting, subtle ways, a lot of times people accept the limitations of body culture that you set for them. And we've had that conversation watching certain videos where there's like a knife in a guy's hand and he slashes the person's neck. I'm trying to specifically not call them out, but it's an acceptance of a situation that you're already behind in. So of course the guy wins. Like it's a silly thing, but that's an acceptance of a body culture proposition, right? And we do that. When we allow somebody to enter our space against our better judgment. Those are examples that we do every day that we don't really, like the one awkward guy who has, the close talker moment. You wouldn't normally let anybody in there if you felt like you were under threat, but at the same time, you don't know that you're under threat, so you let this person in. And those are body culture issues that we have to grow to understand. And so a lot of what I'm teaching, as attribute development, is to get people to understand range, right? Well, range is a body culture thing. And you can call it short, medium, long range, but I find that mostly to be BS, because they'll say a kick is long range and a punch is short range, but I can kick you and punch you at just about the same range. It's just a matter of how you move your body to fulfill it. And but these structures, these setups are just based on what we accept as a body culture to begin with, and there's always an acceptance. It doesn't matter who it is. So my goal is to try to get people to see it, get people to break it, and then get them to find their own and to move in ways that improve their overall process. And so we do things that emphasize, a lot more body movement, because most people are pretty adept at moving their hands. Even if you're a computer guy, you know how to reach for your coffee and pick up your coffee and, whatever. So you have some capabilities with your arms and hands, and but most people haven't figured out really how to walk, and they haven't figured out how to move their body. And so I emphasize those things quite a bit, because I find them to be the weakest link in at least Western culture.
Well, in that post-podcast conversation, we were talking a little bit about how body culture starts to interact with social culture, social expectations, social mores. I've found when teaching.
You use such fancy words. I'm sort of like this little guy who just doesn't. I don't know. I just keep it simple, stupid.
Yeah. All right. So social expectations, maybe.
Whatever you want to say. I just find it interesting because I'm over here like blubbering for words, trying to figure out the way to say what I know. But you have these very intricate, elaborate associations already.
Well, funny enough, when you start researching this stuff, you find out that there's already a body of work out there describing a lot of the terms that I was groping for. So I just steal their terms and give credit, where it's due, every chance I can. But when I've been getting back to what we were talking about, when I've been teaching women specifically, one of the things that comes up with range is they'll, if they've had a traumatic event, being attacked or whatever, they'll say, "Oh, well, I had somebody come at me," and I was like, "Okay, so back up. Where did this start?" "Well, he started getting closer." "How did you feel?" "Well, the guy was being creepy." "Well, why didn't you stop or stop him or start yelling or whatever?" "I didn't want to be rude."
Yeah.
"Well, do you think being rude would have sucked less than getting your, eye sockets fractured by this dude's face?" Well, looking back on it, I think that's probably true. Well, me too. But
obvious, but you don't know it at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's a very cultural thing that takes place actually across many cultures, which I find really interesting. Is the I have to say I've seen many Indonesian teachers who rely on cultural etiquette to perform their better techniques, And maybe, I don't know, better techniques maybe is an exaggeration, but when you take away cultural etiquette, right, which is really what is happening in chaos, that crap does not work, you know. And I've seen it in every culture. We were specifically talking about Silat, so that's why I use that. But I've seen it here, you know. I've seen it in my own classes, you know.
Yeah.
How many times have I had to tell you guys, no, punch me in the freaking nose? Like, I'm asking you to hit me, do it. And because it doesn't work if you don't commit to hitting me. A lot of this stuff doesn't work unless there's a intent to harm. And, you know, actually, the video I just posted this past week of stick stuff, you know, I'm like, no, you have to hit me. You know, you see me pointing at my nose going, no, do that again, hit me. Because people don't, you know, cultural etiquette just doesn't set up well for that. And that's the kind of cultural acceptance of body culture I was talking about previously. So
we've addressed that specifically in the training group I lead down here, is talking to everybody and saying, look, you know, when you do this, you need to attack your training partner honestly. It doesn't have to be full speed or full power, but the targeting needs to be on point, because otherwise, if he's not defending against a legitimate attack, you're actually creating a scar in training.
Exactly.
And you may be contributing to him getting his ass kicked when he needs this.
Yeah. Well, and honestly, you know, and I look at it like both parties are developing improperly.
Yes.
You know, that's it. To me, that's one of those others. It's talked about a little bit, but it's a underemphasized component. Like, if you never learned that you should hit somebody, I'm not even talking about technique, right? I mean, technique is part of it. Yeah, if I'm aiming at your nose, but I never aim at your nose, obviously I'm not developing the skills necessary. But more importantly, I'm not developing the actual mental capability to hit you, right? And that's a bigger structural flaw to me than the component of technique itself. So
I was having a conversation with one of my school owner friends in martial arts school a couple of years ago, and he was kind of perplexed because we were talking about his black belts were less likely to create injury than white belts just walking in off the street. And you'd watch him move with his black belts, and they'd all have the same flinch responses towards him that had been trained in since day one. So he could pretty much do anything he wanted to these guys.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's like a dog that you start training when it's 5 pounds, and when it's 105 pounds, it doesn't realize that it's not a puppy anymore.
Yeah.
And, you know, he was having trouble creating combative people at an instructor or black belt level. It's just, you know, hey, you spent 8 years scarring these guys in training. And now they're, you know, you haven't broken their spirit. It's not that it's not salvageable. It's just, it's going to take specific work at a very high level for a long time to get it out.
And there's that component, you know, that if he's the only person, which I'm sure is not the case, but if he's the only person that they are responding like that to, then, you know, all is not lost by any means, because, you know, that's more of a mechanism for survival within that school. But if they're, you know, fighting other people and carrying on that way with other people, that's a problem. If you can, you know, we all have our built-in responses, you know. That's one of those body culture issues that maybe it's not even a body culture issue. It's a specific, you know, personalized body culture, right? I have flinch responses that I can't freaking get rid of. And the reason you can't get rid of them is because they're a flinch response. You know, it is your genetic makeup. This is what you do. Why you got that? I don't know. How do you fix it? I don't know. What I have finally come to in those is not only can you fix them to some extent, not only can't you fix them to some extent, you can at least modify them. So that's what I've taken to doing a lot. A lot of PSP has flinch responses in there. You just have to figure out what they are, kind of, and then use how you respond to them as recovery almost more than as the method, right? Because you're gonna flinch, right? Mike Tyson saying everybody's got a plan until they get hit.
Yep.
It's that, right? So once you're hit, what are you doing? It's not that you are suddenly not going to try to cover your face up because you got hit, because CLOT says you shouldn't cover your face up. You're going to cover your face up, right? So you don't get hit twice. The thing is moving from that into something you already know how to do so that your process of recovery helps you. That's more important sometimes. I won't say more important. It's an often overlooked component, I think, in training that is part of our body culture, is to try to build that. How do you recover when things go wrong, when you misunderstood space, when you misunderstood a person's intent and you get cold-cocked? How do you respond? What do you do to recover? So,
yeah, and that's kind of, you start diagnosing what is your personal body culture, and being aware of those flinch responses in yourself. The first martial art I ever studied was a certain kicking art, and I have not studied that art for well over 10 years at this point.
Yeah.
And if I get really popped, I will still go into some of the kick combinations in that art. And the thing that annoys me the most is they are often the last thing in the world that I want to do at that juncture in time.
Yeah, no, I mean, those are the ones that really never want to change too. It's funny to me because I have this one catch that I always do, and it's always against the kick, and it leaves me in the most awkward position, but it's my response to that startle from this kick, right? And it leaves me in that really just, what the hell am I going to do with this? Because I don't know what, it's like a really weird position. So I have to figure out, okay, I'm just going to assume this position as a starting point now. Now what am I going to do? Rather than look at it like, how do I beat that from happening? I have to look at how then do I recover from that? Because by doing that, then I at least have a process to getting, regaining my own process and control again in the situation, which is always, how do we lead the dance is kind of the long-term thing. So, and an individual body culture is such a, we talk about body culture from, Western, Eastern, Southeast, South, whatever, it doesn't matter. A regional thing, but then you have individual body cultures, preferences. And that's like, nobody knows that but you. And the only way we can learn about ourselves most of the time is by putting ourselves through a process of learning about other people's body culture, and then we start to become aware of our own. So it's important to have multiple people that you fight and that you interact with regularly with the material to sort of explore all those things.
Well, I think too, you start to really discover that when you get off the edges of the map and you're uncomfortable.
Excuse me.
And I think that's why a lot of practitioners don't do it. It took specific conscious effort on my part to sit down and go, okay, this makes me uncomfortable. I'm going to do more of that.
Yeah.
That's not a natural, instinctive human course of action.
Right.
The normal course of action is, I hate this and I'm never ever going to do it, and if I can get out of it anyway, I'll use mental gymnastics or whatever I can do to reason myself out of this so that I don't have to do this again. Versus
yeah, I mean, that's one of those things. That's what we've talked about this in different contexts, but that's exactly the same premise as somebody who says, I would never do that in the street, When you're training and
favorite.
you're going through that whole thing, most of the time you don't have enough experience to make that judgment, right? It takes a lot of training. I feel like it takes a reasonable amount of training to get to a place where you can say the value of this is not, it doesn't outweigh the risk of it, So it's a funny thing. Now there are certain things you just know from the start. Well, I'm running a blade across my throat, so that doesn't seem like a good thing. That's probably true, right? Like that doesn't really need to be disputed so much. But things where it's more like your mechanical issues are still there and you're just not comfortable with it, that's the kind of stuff where I feel like, you have to pick through that and balance that between body culture, and training. Like that's a thing.
Yeah, well, it takes specific conscious effort that's repeated over time to do something that you probably won't like and is uncomfortable, not just for physical reasons, but also for psychological ones.
Yeah.
Some of the girls that I mentioned earlier that I trained with are a little bit introverted. So when we do exercises, okay, you're going to start yelling at this guy.
Yeah.
I don't yell. Well, today you're going to yell.
Yeah.
But I don't do that. Well, cool. And you could have said that, with conviction right up until you walked into the door today, and then today that changes.
Yeah. Yeah, that to me is a perfect example of where a teacher's responsibility comes in to specifically guide a student. And if we're not doing that, who is, right? Like, yeah. It's not going to happen. You're not going to have their mom's not suddenly go, oh, you need to yell at me more. That's not going to happen, right? So those are things where that specific, people sometimes ask me, well, how do you teach attributes? Well, I can give you a list of the attributes that I recognize and that I work to develop in people, but it isn't always the same process to get there, because everybody's got their own kind of setups. Now, generally, we have some for the system, right, that we do. We have methods, right? But those methods could have drills that are added just specifically for a day just to get somebody to do something. This past week, I had guys working. So I have a couple of guys. One of them has training. Actually, one has a lot of training in ninjutsu, one has some training in Kali and Wing Chun, and then I have another guy who's brand new to martial arts, right? I couldn't have a broader selection, pretty much. And 3 guys, 3 completely different training levels. And so I had them working on whip today, or last week. And the reason I had them using whip, it was like, well, if you don't understand power development, power curve, right, which you feel through a whip, then you'll never understand, when I say relax, you're never going to do it because you don't understand that you really have to relax to do whip well. And then there's that point at which your power is exerted through the wrist into the hand and down the whip. All of that is this extension that you feel. And, so I had him working on it, even though that's that's actually the very last thing we actually train in the system. I felt like it was one of those moments where you could have that development of attribute, at least give them a sense of what they're aiming for in a way that pulls them forward down the road.
Oh, absolutely. And it's funny, you said that it's not often the same process for each student. My experience has been that it's almost never the same process for each student, because everybody has to adjust, for their personal body culture. And as a teacher, being able to specifically draw that out and diagnose that, using the yelling thing as an example, my roommate is a large Puerto Rican male who is a former NCO in the Air Force. Getting him to yell is not very difficult. It comes out at volume with trimmings. But getting him to work...
I'll even get some spittle in there, too.
Oh, it's... there's close talkers, and then they're standing in the splash zone. like you're in SeaWorld. And you know, there's definitely one of those things for him is, you know, the case. But you know, there's other things working on knife, working on some other areas of the system. You know, it's important to have different drills for him.
Yeah. But he also works the door too, right?
Yeah. He and I bounced together for a little bit, and then he's kept it up. He likes the half off his drinks when he goes out to our local party district, which is either the best thing or the worst thing that's ever happened to him. I haven't figured that out yet.
Yeah, right. Time will tell.
Yeah.
Liver number 7.
Yeah, well, you know, I've never heard that other guy, the big guy, the 320-pounder that I mentioned, is also, he's been bouncing out there in our local party district for 10 or 12 years.
Yeah.
And I've never heard anybody else or 2 fingers or 3 fingers of your finest rumplements before.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's just a little bit different. Like I noticed with our really big guy, getting in close to him makes him uncomfortable typically.
Yeah.
He's a standoff striker. He likes you to be out there, and he likes to be able to see what you're doing and then punch you in the face until you fall over.
Yeah. That's pretty much my preference too. I mean, I generally my preference is not to work close, you know, and as part of that comes from dealing with bigger guys. When you are consistently faced with guys who can use their range and distance and space and timing, or like you can adjust that of course for smaller people, right? But there's still a space of, yeah, I know where I can hit you from, and I'm going to figure out the best ways to transition to that range without you really being aware of that, assuming you have the time for that kind of play, right? But yeah, for sure, if I can do it, I'm out there.
Well, and that goes into the differences that we talked about too in size. You know, with his size, if he just starts dropping bombs on you from far away, they don't even need to be particularly good punches.
Yeah.
You have somebody who's, you know, a power lifter and throws cattle around during the week and weighs 320 pounds. All of his ass doesn't need to be in that punch, just a little bit of it. And if you get clipped, it'll probably set up the second one, and then that's about where this ends, usually.
But, yeah, and the other thing about that kind of a range to me is, you know, this brings up actually another point of body culture, I think in the West, specifically probably more in the U.S. than anywhere else, is that most people are either carrying a blade or they're carrying a gun. There's a lot of, I don't say most people, a lot of people are. And a lot of the element that you would deal with that are not just, you know, drunk fighting or whatever, are probably the ones who are most likely you're going to have to deal with. And, you know, so that understanding range critical, and understanding the differences of body culture when somebody's carrying versus when they're not. You know, we did this street seminar a while back there in Florida with you guys, and, you know, obviously you guys are already aware of this because you do your own training that way, but, you know, when somebody blades so you can't see their arm, you know, that's a pretty specific thing. They're hiding, and they're hiding for a reason. Most often it's not so they can throw their overhand hook. It could be, but generally it's because they're drawing something.
There's going to be something in that hand when it comes back around.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's a thing that specifically, you know, I think is maybe more Western. Although in Indonesia, I mean, people are not afraid to mug you with a celurit or a machete. You know, I mean, this happens. And a celurit will make you shit yourself. Yeah. Like, I think that's a crazy thing to have to deal with.
If I can figure out how to carry one.
Yeah, I mean, just like that's sort of the action of with the click of or the slide action of a gun, you know, that whole thing. Like when you see a celurit, you go, I'm nervous. I should be nervous. So especially if it's chorok, you know, a big one.
Even
anyway,
the smaller ones, I don't know that I necessarily want to get into a game of tag with that, because I feel that the guy with the chalur, which is for those listening, is a sickle, like a hand sickle. But if you choose to Google it, it's spelled CELURIT. Is one of the spellings I've seen.
Yeah. CLU without the E as well.
But if you look at that, you're like, I need to be really good every time, and this guy just needs to get a little bit lucky once.
Yeah, right. I mean, and that's kind of the issue with any kind of a blade deal, and or defense against a gun. But yeah, those are aspects which I think that need to be paid attention a little bit more. And I just talked about I posted on the leadership site for that guy with the razor blades. Actually, I didn't post it. Mike did, I think, for the guy spitting out razor blades from his mouth and fighting that way. I mean, that's another one of those where it's like, okay, that's a whole other thing.
Well, and the thing that I get amused about looking at stuff like that is a lot of people will look at that and say, that's not common to my culture, so I'm not going to train it.
Yeah.
But if it's common to prison culture, or even more probable to run into in a culture that you might be facing at some point.
Itself, most likely.
Yeah. It makes it reasonable to figure out some way to deal with that, or to make, build assumptions into your practice that make it so if you are running across one of these people, you're not starting so far behind the ball that you're never going to recover.
Yeah.
And
those are tough ones. Anyway, those are pretty rife examples of what I would view as our body culture within the U.S. that we have to sort of deal with. And you and I talked briefly. I know this is getting really long, so I don't want to overkill it. But
we told them it was going to go long. They can listen or not.
Yeah. The other thing that happens is that PSP. What I was trying to do is to set up something that allows every person who studies it the opportunity. So ultimately, my goal with PSP is to have enough of a leadership team from around the world that we're able to continuously dissect, maybe not continuously, hopefully we get to a point of balance, but where we're able to dissect some of those things and make appropriate adaptations that fit even further a broader contingent of body cultures. But my hope is that it's set up right now as pretty effectively doing that, because it's broad enough, and because it's broad enough, it's also general enough that you can tweak accordingly. That's kind of always my goal with PSP, is to, you have to have specifics, because you got to be able to, at the end of the day, everything I'm teaching, I want to be able to say undoubtedly makes a person safer, right? But beyond that, how that takes place could change from culture to culture slightly, and I think it would be slightly. I don't think it would be major, but in South America, they deal with different things. I'm imagining that there's a hell of a lot more ground game. But maybe I'm wrong, but it seems as though that's a thing. And I know that their intent with knife and stick is pretty intent. So, the culture there is different. Their tools are different. Their body culture is different. It's not so different, but it's different enough, I think, that it would be of value to, have a symposium-style leadership group that helps keep PSP continuously, becoming better.
Well, I think, looking at South America, and from what I've seen, I've been to Mexico, Argentina, and Belize. Some of those at fair lengths, mission trips of a month or more, and getting to kind of know the people in there. It's interesting to see the cultural differences when it comes to, use of tools. Over in Mexico and Belize, for instance, a man had a machete.
Yeah.
If you walked out of your door, just like putting on your pants, you would have your machete on. And I'm even talking about like these guys would bring machetes to church, and stuff like that that we wouldn't necessarily assume. I mean, I have a lot of friends that carry in, in church they carry a pistol or whatever because of all the shootings that have been going on lately. But I'm aware that my friends group is not normal by any stretch of the imagination. But
you're alt pistol.
Yeah, alt pistol. We're control pistol. But over here in America, and I should go back in South America, because of the agrarian nature of the tools. They're used to agricultural work, and for that you use an edge. You typically don't stab your rice to harvest it. Over here in America, we have the Folsom machine or the sewing machine. It goes by a bunch of different names, but that's all forehand point-based attacks, and it's just poking holes in somebody, and it's super hard to deal with if you haven't looked at it before.
Yeah.
And that coming out of our prison system where there is no real agricultural influence, and my theory on that being that it's easier to put a point on something than it is to put a good edge on something. You can put a point on a toothbrush and it will work just as well, at least once.
I mean, it's basic mechanics. Everybody points, right?
Yeah.
So it just fills out really easily. I mean, that's why point shooting is as good as it is.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably, we'll have to do one on the gun at some point. No pun intended.
That'll be for you.
I'll just drone on. That'll be great. But I'm getting the high sign. Yeah, I'm getting the high sign for my the love of my life over here. She apparently wants me to go with her to feed ourselves. So, you think after almost an hour we've reached a good stopping point?
Yeah, I think that's great.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I really do. I think this has been a pretty interesting topic, and PSP for the most part, I feel like I've done what I know to do, at least to address Western culture as well as I can, and still maintain some of the aspects. Basically, you can insert anytime the more of the Southeast Asian culture back. It's not so far away, so I feel like I've found a good balance of what's true as a core. So
yeah, I feel like that as well. I've found that even though we don't have a lot of, like, for instance, pistol stuff, I'm for those listening, I'm a bit of a gun junkie. I train with them and everything. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's definitely mine. But I found PSP to work for that as well, as far as some of the positioning and definitely the footwork has been a lot of help in force-on-force training. So yeah, I look forward to exploring it more. But for those who are listening, if you want to find out more about PSP, you can go to combat-celot.net or celot.us, I think was the other URL, Guru?
Yeah, there's actually several, but that's those two are both accurate.
Okay. And we've got a YouTube channel, Celot Junkie 1, for Guru Stark, and you can also find us on Facebook. Just type in Combat Celot. So thanks everybody for listening, and